What would you do if someone gave you a house and you found out the people who lived there before had been hiding something terrible inside the walls for almost 100 years? Today, we're going to tell you about one of the most scary family secrets ever found in American history. This is the story of the Durnham family from Millbrook, Connecticut, and the terrible discovery that would make a small New England town shake with fear. But before we start, I need to warn you. This story has things in it that some people might find very upsetting. What the Durnham family had behind those walls is hard to understand, and the truth they tried so hard to keep secret would end up destroying them all. If you don't like hearing about violence against children or ritual killing, you might want to stop reading now. For everyone else, get ready for a journey into one of America's darkest family secrets. Let me tell you about Sarah Collins, a 28-year-old writer from Boston who worked on her own writing about old mysteries and crimes that were never solved. She had made a name for herself by looking into cold cases for true crime magazines, but nothing in her job had gotten her ready for what she would find on October 15th, 2019, when she got something she never thought she would get. A huge Victorian house from her great-aunt Margaret Durnham, a woman she had only seen 2 times in her whole life. The first time they met was at Sarah's college graduation in 2013. Margaret had shown up without warning, a fancy old woman with bright blue eyes and a smile that made people feel uncomfortable. She had told Sarah she was proud of her journalism degree and said something strange that would stay with Sarah for years. The truth has a way of finding people brave enough to look for it, dear. Remember that. The second and last time they met was at Margaret's funeral, just 2 weeks before Sarah got the paper saying she owned the house. Margaret Durnham had been the last person still alive from one of Millbrook's oldest and most important families. The Durnhams had made their money in the cloth-making business during the late 1800s, building their huge house on Elm Street in 1887. The 3-floor Victorian house sat on 12 acres of really good Connecticut land, complete with rooms for servants, a house for carriages, and fancy gardens that had once been what the community was most proud of. For more than 130 years, the family had lived in that house, having a lot of power over the small town's money and government. The Durnham textile mill had given jobs to almost half the town when it was busiest. And even after it closed in the 1960s, the family's money kept helping local businesses and charities. Margaret's death left the house empty for the first time since it was built, and with it came the end of a time that not many people in Millbrook were sad to see finish. Sarah had planned to sell the house right away. After all, she lived in a tiny studio apartment in Boston's North End, had no connection to Millbrook, and the cost of taking care of a 12-room house would use up all her freelance money in just a few months. The property taxes alone were more than she made in 3 months. But when she came to look at the property on that cold October afternoon, she found something that would change everything. The house felt wrong from the moment she got out of her Honda Civic. The October sky was cloudy, making long shadows across the grass that had grown too long. But there was something more than just the weather making the feeling so heavy and dark. The big house stood in front of her like something from a scary book, its dark windows looking like they were watching her walk closer. The person selling the house had told her that the house had been empty for months, that Margaret had lived by herself in her last years with only someone who came to help part-time, but nothing had prepared her for the heavy feeling of evil that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The house felt wrong. I know that sounds crazy, but from the moment I went inside, there was this heavy feeling, like the walls themselves were watching me. The air was thick and still, even though it was cold outside in October. And there was this feeling underneath of, I don't know how to say it, fear, guilt, and the smell. God, the smell was terrible, like something had died and was left to rot, but also something like medicine, like chemicals. It made me feel sick. The inside was like a time machine showing wealth and things falling apart. Heavy velvet curtains blocked most of the natural light, making the rooms always look like it was almost dark. Dust sheets covered most of the furniture, but what Sarah could see showed a family that had spent a lot of money on decorating. Persian rugs, crystal lights hanging from the ceiling, and oil paintings in gold frames were in every room. But there was something wrong about it all. Something that made Sarah's writer instincts feel like something bad was happening. But Sarah was a writer, and writers follow their feelings. Instead of leaving and coming back with the real estate person as she had planned, She decided to stay the night and look through the house completely. She had brought a sleeping bag and camping stuff, thinking she might need to stay overnight if looking at the house took longer than she thought. It was a choice that would bother her forever, but would also show a truth that had been hidden for almost 100 years. Sarah started looking around on the first floor, where she found the normal rooms of a big Victorian home, a fancy sitting room with bookshelves from floor to ceiling, a dining room that could fit 20 people, a kitchen that had been updated sometime in the 1950s, but still had its original huge cast iron stove. But it was in the study that she found her first sign that something was wrong. The desk drawers were locked, but one had been forced open recently, its papers scattered everywhere. In the papers, she found letters going back many years, all written to the keeper and signed with just initials instead of full names. The letters talked in code language about deliveries and ceremonies and keeping up traditions. One letter from 1994 said more clearly, "Thomas arrives next month. All preparations have been made following the old rules. The family is excited to go ahead with the harvest." Sarah took pictures of everything with her phone, her hands shaking as she started to understand that she had found something much more evil than a simple house she had gotten from her aunt. The second floor had the bedrooms, and it was here that Sarah made her most scary discovery yet. Family pictures going back 5 generations were on the hallway walls, but with one strange thing that made her blood feel cold. Every single picture going back to the 1880s showed families with an odd number of children, but in each photo, you could see light marks like someone had been carefully removed from the pictures, cut out, erased. The missing people weren't random. In every single picture, it was always one child, always looked like they were between 12 and 16 years old, and always a family member still in the photos had the same look on their faces, a mix of sadness and guilt that seemed to go beyond what photos could show. But there was something else in their eyes, too, something that made Sarah feel very cold. They looked satisfied, like they had gotten something from the missing child being gone. She spent hours looking at each picture, taking detailed photos and notes. The oldest one showed Jeremiah Durnham, the family leader, with his wife Constance and their 4 children. But you could clearly see where a 5th child had been, carefully cut away very precisely. This same thing continued through every generation. Children removed, families not complete, and always that same look of guilty satisfaction on the faces of the family members who were still there. It was on the 3rd floor in what looked like a child's bedroom that Sarah made her first big discovery. The room was different from the others, taken care of more recently even though the decorations were obviously old. The wallpaper had a happy pattern of sailboats and anchors clearly chosen for a young boy, but the whole feeling was very uncomfortable. While looking at the walls more closely, she saw a part near the window that seemed a little different, less faded, like it had been replaced more recently than the rest. I pushed against it, and I could feel it move a little. There was definitely something behind there, some kind of empty space. I went downstairs and found a kitchen knife, then came back and carefully cut through the wallpaper. I thought maybe I'd find old newspapers or insulation, something normal. What I found underneath, I still have bad dreams about it. Behind the wallpaper was a small space, about 3 feet by 3 feet and about 2 feet deep. And inside that space was a collection of things that told a story no family should ever have to tell. Children's clothes from different time periods, carefully folded and kept safe. A collection of diaries going back to 1926, their leather covers worn, but still in good shape. And most scary of all, dozens of photos showing children who looked like the missing people from the family pictures downstairs. The clothes were in perfect shape, kept safe somehow from getting old and worn. There were short pants and suspenders from the 1920s, work clothes from the 1940s, bell-bottom jeans from the 1970s, and newer clothes from recent years. Each set was carefully labeled with dates and a name, Thomas. And the diaries, they all had the same name written inside the cover in different handwriting styles. Thomas. But they covered many years. Thomas from 1926, Thomas from 1941, Thomas from 1967, Thomas from 1984, Thomas from 2003. Sarah sat on the floor of that child's bedroom, surrounded by proof of something impossible. How could someone named Thomas have been writing diaries for over 80 years? And why had the Durnham family been hiding these things? As a writer, she knew she had to look into this more, but every feeling was screaming at her to leave right away. The house seemed to be pressing in on her, and she could swear she heard footsteps in the hallway, though she knew she was alone. Fighting her fear, she opened the oldest diary from 1926. The handwriting was that of a child, careful and neat in a way that showed formal education. The diaries showed a pattern that was both impossible and terrifying. Each one told the story of a boy named Thomas who lived with the Durnham family for exactly 1 year from his 12th birthday until his 13th. March 15th, 1926. Today is my 12th birthday, and the Durnhams have welcomed me into their home. They say I'm part of the family now, but Mother and Father warned me never tell anyone where I came from. They say it's for my own safety. Mr. Durnham gave me this diary and said I should write in it every day to write down my thoughts and what happens to me. He says it's important for the family history. The entries that came after showed a picture of a family that was loving and caring, but with strange rules and rituals that the children had to follow without asking questions. The boy wrote about big meals, expensive clothes, teaching in subjects that seemed too hard for his age. But there were also scary things that became clearer as Sarah read more of the diary. March 28th, 1926. We're not allowed in the basement. Mr. Durnham says there are dangerous chemicals down there from his cloth-making work, but I heard strange sounds coming from down there last night, like singing or chanting. Mrs. Durnham makes me special meals different from what the other children eat. She says I need to stay strong and healthy. She also gives me these bitter pills every morning that make me feel strange and sleepy. April 10th, 1926. The other children don't talk to me much. When I try to play with them, they get the scared look in their eyes and walk away. Margaret, who's about my age, told me yesterday that I shouldn't get too comfortable here. When I asked her what she meant, she just said, "You'll understand when it's time." I don't know what she's talking about, but it makes me nervous. The diary entries went on for months, telling about a year being treated while mixed with growing worry. The boy wrote about feeling alone, about strange dreams that felt more like visions, about a growing feeling that something terrible was being planned for him. And then, suddenly, the entry stopped with a final scary note. March 14th, 1927. Tomorrow is my 13th birthday. Mr. Durnham says it's time for me to join the family forever. I don't know what he means, but I'm scared. If anyone finds this diary, please tell my parents I love them. With this new information, Sarah started a careful search of the whole house, looking for more hidden spaces. What she found was a network of hidden areas throughout the big house, each one containing similar collections, closed diaries, and photos of different boys, all named Thomas, covering almost a century. The pattern was exact and careful, showing a level of organization that meant planning across generations. Every 17 years, like clockwork, a new Thomas would arrive at the Durnham House. On his 12th birthday, for exactly 1 year, he would live as part of the family, treated with kindness and luxury while being prepared for something that the diaries never clearly said, but that filled each boy with more and more fear as his 13th birthday got closer. And then the diary entries would stop. I found proof of 6 different Thomas boys over 93 years, 1926, 1943, 1960, 1977, 1994, and 2011, each cycle lasting exactly 1 year, each ending the same way with a sudden final entry that simply said, "It's time." The math precision was terrifying. This wasn't random violence or crimes done in anger. This was organized, planned, ritualistic. By now, it was well past midnight, and Sarah knew she should leave, call the police, give this horror to someone else. But her writer instincts were in full control now. She had found the story of a lifetime, and she couldn't walk away without understanding everything about what had happened in this house. Against her better judgment, she decided to drive into town and try to find someone who might have answers. Looking for answers, Sarah drove into Millbrook proper as the sun was coming up, hoping to find an early opening restaurant or coffee shop where she might talk to local people. What she found was a town that had been keeping the Durnham family secret for generations, and whose people seemed really afraid to talk about anything related to the family. The first person she talked to was Harold Petton, a 78-year-old man. She found feeding pigeons in the town square. When she mentioned the Durnham House, his face went white, and he looked around nervously like he was afraid someone might be listening. Everyone knew. The whole damn town knew. But nobody talked about it. My grandfather told me his father told him. The Durnhams, they weren't like other people. There was something unnatural about them, something that went back generations. And those boys they took in, well, they came from families who owed the Durnhams money. Families who had nowhere else to turn. Harold's story opened up a flood of information that showed a picture of taking advantage of people that had been going on for more than 100 years. The Durnham family, it turned out, had been the main source of jobs in Millbrook for generations. When families got into debt, which happened a lot during hard economic times like the Great Depression, the economic problems of the 1890s, or more recently the recession of 2008, the Durnhams would make them an offer they couldn't say no to. They forgive the debt completely, sometimes thousands of dollars. But in exchange, the family had to give up their youngest son when he turned 12. Just for a year, they said, just until he turned 13. The boy would be educated, fed, clothed, and treated like a member of the family. After his 13th birthday, they said he would be returned with enough money to set him up for life. And the families, they were so desperate, they agreed. But Harold's story took an even darker turn as he told what happened to families who said no to the Durnhams' offer. Strange accidents, house fires, business failures that seemed to target anyone who went against the family. The message was clear. Working with them meant surviving. Fighting them meant being destroyed. Over the years, the town had learned to simply look the other way when the Durnhams made their regular requests to take care of children temporarily. But Sarah's research showed something even more disturbing. When she visited the town clerk's office and looked at the official records, she found reports of missing children, always boys, always around age 13, always from families that had worked for the Durnhams. The pattern went back many years with reports filed by desperate parents who said their sons had disappeared without any sign of where they went. The reports were filed, but they were never looked into. The sheriff's department would mark them as runaways and close the cases within 48 hours. Every single time. I found papers going back to the 1940s showing the same pattern. A boy would disappear. Parents would file a missing person report. And within 2 days, the case would be closed with a note that the child had run away to find his fortune in the big city. What made this even more suspicious was that these supposed runaways never contacted their families again. Never sent letters or made phone calls, never showed up anywhere else in the country. In a time before social media, it might have been possible for someone to disappear completely. But the huge number of cases, and when they happened, showed something much more evil than teenage rebellion. Sarah spent the whole day in the town hall taking pictures of documents and building a timeline of disappearances that matched exactly with the dates she'd found in the hidden diaries. 6 boys over 93 years, each disappearing just after their 13th birthday, each disappearance officially called a runaway case. Even though everything inside her was telling her to leave, to call the FBI, and give this evidence to professionals, Sarah knew she had to see what the Durnhams had hidden in the basement. The diaries all talk about the basement as a place they weren't allowed to go, and every investigation she'd ever done had taught her that the most important evidence was always found in the places people tried hardest to hide. Using a crowbar she found in the carriage house, she broke through the many locks that kept the basement door closed. The locks themselves told a story. Layers of security added over the years, from simple padlocks to modern deadbolts to what looked like a custom-made steel bar that took a lot of effort to remove. Whatever was down there, the Durnhams had been very serious about keeping people out. The stairs were steep and narrow, and the smell that filled the whole house was overwhelming here where it came from. Sarah went down slowly, her flashlight cutting through the darkness to show something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. What she found went against every normal explanation. The basement had been changed into something that looked like a mix between a medieval laboratory and a ritual room. The walls were lined with stone, clearly added long after the house was first built. Stone tables with channels carved into their surfaces were in the center of the room, and surgical tools from different time periods hung from hooks on the walls like some scary museum display. There were charts on the walls, drawings of the human body that seemed to focus on the blood system and nervous system. And in the center of the room was this huge stone altar with channels carved into it, leading to drains in the floor. The whole place smelled of death and chemicals, but also something else, something that reminded me of a hospital operating room. Clean and sterile, but underneath it all, the unmistakable smell of decay. But the most terrible discovery was a series of journals belonging to different generations of Durnhams, carefully kept safe in glass cases like precious treasures. These weren't hidden away like the boys' diaries upstairs. They were proudly shown on specially built shelves, telling about a family tradition that had continued for almost a century. The boy arrived today, Thomas number 6. He is strong and healthy, just as the others were. The preparation year starts now. Father says a ritual must be done on the anniversary of his arrival, when the moon is dark and the line between worlds is thinnest. It is the only way to make sure our family keeps having money and living long lives. The old ways must be kept. The journals showed the Durnhams' belief in a ritual that they said would move the life force of young boys to the family members, making sure they lived long and had money. But these weren't the writings of crazy people. The entries were careful, scientific, telling about preparations and procedures with the exactness of medical textbooks. They talked about harvesting methods developed over generations, of ways to preserve things that made sure they got the most essence possible. Each journal entry told about preparations for what they called the harvest, a ceremony that apparently happened exactly 1 year after each boy arrived. The rituals were described in clinical detail, involving procedures that were clearly made to slowly drain the life from the victim, while keeping them alive as long as possible. The Durnhams believed that fear and suffering made what they were stealing more powerful, so the final ritual was made to create as much of both as possible. But perhaps most disturbing was the way the journals wrote down the effects of their ceremonies. Each generation of Durnhams lived much longer than should have been possible, stayed healthy and strong well into ages that should have been impossible for their time periods. The first Thomas, sacrificed in 1927, had apparently given the family an extra 20 years of life. The second had renewed this gift, and so on through the generations. Sarah's great-aunt Margaret, the woman who had left the house, had been born in 1924. According to the family journals, she should have died many years ago from natural causes. But the record showed something impossible. Margaret had somehow lived to be 95 years old, even though many family members said she looked barely 60 when she died. I started doing the math, and it didn't add up. If the ritual worked the way the journals described, Margaret would have been part of at least 4 of the ceremonies. She would have been there when Thomas number 2 disappeared in 1943, number 3 in 1960, number 4 in 1977, and number 5 in 1994. She would have been an active part in the murder of 4 children. Hospital records that Sarah got show that Margaret had never been seriously sick, never showed signs of diseases that come with old age, and had died peacefully in her sleep with no clear cause of death. For someone born in 1924, this was impossible according to statistics. The average life length for women born in that time was around 65 years, and very few lived past 85 without big health problems. But the most scary discovery was Margaret's personal journal, found in a locked drawer of an old desk in the basement. The last entry was written just 3 days before she died and showed why Sarah had gotten a house. I can feel them calling to me, all the Thomas boys. Their spirits have been getting stronger as I get weaker. They want justice, and I'm too tired to fight them anymore. The guilt has been eating at me for many years, but the family traditions were too strong to break. Perhaps it's time the truth came out. I'm leaving the house to Sarah, my brother's granddaughter. She's a journalist, a seeker of truth. If anyone can show what we've done and give those boys the justice they deserve, it's her. The most recent Thomas had disappeared in 2012. Thomas Williams, age 13, whose family had lost their home in the 2008 financial crisis and had been working for the Durnhams as caretakers. Unlike the others, Thomas Williams had a sister who never stopped looking for him, a sister who had spent the last 10 years trying to find out the truth about his disappearance. I was 16 when Tommy disappeared. The police said he ran away, but Tommy wouldn't do that. He was scared of the dark. He wouldn't have left on his own at night. and he was excited about starting high school the next fall. He had made plans with his friends. I knew the Durnhams had something to do with it, but nobody would listen to me. They were too powerful, too. Jenny Williams had spent the last 10 years looking into her brother's disappearance, gathering evidence that the police had ignored and building a case that no one in power wanted to hear. She had found other families whose children had disappeared, written down the pattern of cover-ups, and even tried to search the Durnham property before being arrested for going on their property without permission. When Sarah contacted her after finding Tommy's diary in the house, the two women joined together to finally show the truth. Jenny's evidence filled in gaps in Sarah's discoveries, and together they built a case that couldn't be argued against the Durnham family and the people who helped them. Sarah's discovery proved everything I'd thought. The Durnhams weren't just taking these boys. They were murdering them in ritual ceremonies. And the whole town was part of it, from the sheriff's department to the mayor's office to the local newspaper that never reported on the disappearances. Armed with years of evidence, photos of the basement chamber, the saved diaries, and testimony from Jenny Williams, Sarah and Jenny decided to do one final search of the basement to find proof that couldn't be argued with. Using ground scanning equipment that Jenny had borrowed from a friend who worked in construction, they scanned the basement floor and found what they were looking for. Behind a fake wall that had been built sometime in the 1940s, we found them. 6 sets of bones, each carefully preserved and labeled with dates matching the disappearances. They were arranged like trophies in display cases. Each skeleton showed signs of injury that matched the ritual procedures described in the journals. The discovery was more horrible than either woman had imagined. The remains weren't simply buried or hidden. They had been carefully preserved using methods that the Durnhams had developed over the years, treated with chemicals that stopped them from rotting, and arranged in positions that suggested they were meant to be looked at and honored rather than forgotten. Each set of remains came with personal things. The clothes the boys had been wearing, items from their previous lives, and in some cases final letters they had been forced to write to their families explaining their decision to run away. The letters were clearly written under force with handwriting that became more and more shaky and desperate as the boys realized what was actually happening to them. Sarah immediately contacted the FBI, going around local law enforcement completely giving the evidence that they were part of the cover-up. Federal agents arrived within hours and began what would become the largest criminal investigation in Connecticut's history. The evidence was overwhelming. The Durnham family had been running a ritualistic murder cult for almost a century with the full knowledge and cooperation of big parts of the local community. In 40 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything like this. The level of organization, the documentation, the community-wide cover-up, it represents one of the most elaborate serial killing operations in American history. The fact that it continued for almost a century with multiple generations participating shows a level of organized evil that is hard to understand. The investigation showed that while Margaret was the last surviving Durnham, several town officials and business leaders had known about the family's crimes and had actively helped cover them up. The sheriff's department had been taking payments from a family for years to make sure that missing person cases were never properly looked into. The mayor's office had been part of zoning decisions that kept other development away from the Durnham property. Even the local newspaper had been paid to not report stories about the disappearances. 17 people were arrested in connection with the murders and conspiracy, ranging from current and former law enforcement officers to business leaders who had helped make the cover-up happen. The trials that followed showed the full scope of the horror and the ways an entire community had been corrupted by fear, greed, and choosing not to see. The trial showed the full scope of the horror that had been hidden in Millbrook for almost a century. The Durnhams had convinced themselves that their rituals were necessary to keep their family's success and the town's prosperity. They really believed they were doing service, not committing murder. The defense lawyers tried to argue that the family had been operating under generations of mental illness, but the evidence showed careful planning and deliberate choices made by rational people who simply valued their own comfort over the lives of children. We were told it was for the greater good, that the sacrifice of these boys kept the whole town employed and prosperous. The Durnhams convinced us that their rituals were preventing bigger disasters, that without them the town would face economic collapse, natural disasters, and social chaos. When you're desperate and someone offers you a simple solution to hard problems, you want to believe them, even when that solution involves looking the other way when children disappear. Harold Peton's testimony showed how the conspiracy had been kept going across generations. Each family that participated was bound by guilt and fear, knowing that showing the truth would make them look like they helped with murder. The Durnhams had created a perfect system where everyone involved had too much to lose to break the silence. Sarah gave the mansion to the families of the victims, who decided to have it completely destroyed after the investigation was done. The basement chamber was filled with concrete, and the entire building was torn down to make sure that no trace of the horror remained. In its place, they built a memorial garden with 6 headstones with the names of the murdered boys. I couldn't keep the house. Even after everything was removed, after the FBI had processed every inch of it as a crime scene, I could still feel their presence. Those boys deserved better than to have their memory tied to that place of horror. They deserved a peaceful resting place where people could come to remember them as the children they were, not as victims of an evil family's wrong beliefs. The town of Millbrook went through a complete change after the investigation. New leadership was elected after the mayor and several city council members were arrested. A fund for victims was set up using money taken from Durnham family assets, providing money support for the families and funding for a complete mental health program for the community. But for many residents, the shame of their community's part in this would never fully heal. Justice for Tommy and the other boys was important, but it doesn't bring them back. What matters now is making sure something like this never happens again. We have to teach people to speak up when they see wrong things happening, even when it's easier to look the other way. We have to create systems where vulnerable people can't be silenced or ignored. The FBI's investigation grew far beyond Millbrook when they found letters between the Durnhams and other families across New England. The letters found in Margaret's personal files showed a network of similar people who had been sharing information and supporting each other's activities for many years. Teams of diggers began searching properties connected to these families, looking for more victims. We've found at least 12 other properties where similar activities may have happened. This wasn't just one family's madness. It appears to have been part of a bigger network of ritualistic killers operating across many states. The letters show that these families were in regular contact, sharing methods and reasons for their actions. The Durnham family had been writing letters to families in Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and even as far away as Maine and Rhode Island. The letters showed a hidden culture that had existed alongside normal society for over a century, built around the shared belief that human sacrifice was necessary for prosperity and long life. What we found in Millbrook was just the beginning. These families had created a whole mythology around their actions, complete with elaborate rituals, sacred texts, and yearly meetings where they would share their experiences and plan future activities. They had books passed down through generations telling procedures and justifications. They really believed they were part of something sacred, not criminal. The investigation found evidence of similar disappearances in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts going back to the early 1900s. Police departments across New England began reopening cold cases, looking for patterns that matched what had been found in Millbrook. The scope of the conspiracy was huge, involving dozens of families and possibly hundreds of victims over more than a century. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a criminal psychologist brought in to look at the case, gave insight into how such a systematic pattern of murder could continue for so long without being caught. The Durnham case represents a unique form of shared mental illness that affected not just the immediate family, but an entire community. The economic dependency created a perfect storm for this type of mass wrong belief. When people's survival depends on a single family's generosity, they become willing to ignore even the most terrible crimes. Dr. Carter's analysis showed how economic desperation had made the town vulnerable to the Durnham's influence. During economic hard times, when families faced losing their homes and ways to make money, the Durnhams positioned themselves as saviors while at the same time being the source of the community's problems. This created a cycle of dependency that made resistance almost impossible. The most disturbing aspect is how the rituals became normal over time. Each generation was raised to believe that these murders were not only acceptable but necessary. Children grew up knowing that certain boys would disappear, and they learned not to ask questions. It shows how easily moral boundaries can be worn away when they conflict with survival instincts. Interviews with arrested conspirators showed a common psychological pattern. They had convinced themselves that the boys weren't really being murdered, but were being changed into something greater. This wrong belief allowed them to participate without feeling the full weight of their guilt, creating a mental framework where they could see themselves as participants in something sacred rather than helpers to murder. News of the Millbrook discovery sent shockwaves through small communities across New England. Police departments began reopening cold cases involving missing children, looking for patterns similar to what Sarah had found. The revelation that an entire town could be part of serial murder for almost a century forced law enforcement agencies to reconsider how they investigated disappearances in small, economically dependent communities. We found at least 30 unsolved disappearances that matched the Millbrook pattern: boys between 12 and 14 from financially struggling families, all reported as runaways with minimal investigation done by local law enforcement. We're treating each case as a possible murder now, and we're bringing in federal resources to make sure that local politics can't interfere with the investigations. The investigation showed that the network of families called themselves the Keepers of Prosperity and believed they were following ancient traditions necessary for keeping social order. They had created elaborate reasons for their actions, drawing on corrupted interpretations of various religious and occult traditions to convince themselves that what they were doing was not only acceptable but necessary for the greater good. They had created a whole mythology around their actions, complete with books passed down through generations telling rituals and justifications. They really believed they were part of something sacred, not criminal. The level of organization and the complexity of their belief system shows that this wasn't random violence or crimes of passion, but carefully built ideology that had been made better over many generations. The revelation of the murders devastated the families of the victims, but also brought unexpected relief to some. Parents who had blamed themselves for their children's disappearances finally learned the truth about what had happened, and knowing that their children had been victims of a deliberate conspiracy rather than their own failures as parents provided a complicated form of closure. For 40 years, I blamed myself. I thought, maybe if I had been a better mother, if I had paid more attention, if I had fought harder against giving Tommy to the Durnhams, he wouldn't have disappeared. Finding out he was murdered was horrible, but knowing